Good day, everyone. We're here today to delve into the topic of practical ethics on climate change, guided by the insights of renowned philosopher Peter Singer. We'll explore Singer's utilitarian approach, discuss the disproportionate impacts of climate change, and examine the moral responsibilities of nations. Stay tuned as we navigate this complex ethical landscape together. Practical Ethics is a seminal work by the philosopher Peter Singer, who is known for his utilitarian approach to ethical issues. In this report, we will delve into the pressing issue of climate change. The purpose of this report is to explore Singer's perspective on climate change, its ethical implications, and the moral responsibilities it imposes on us. Singer's work is renowned for its clarity and rigor, and his arguments on climate change are no exception. He presents a compelling case for why we should consider climate change as a matter of urgent ethical concern. This report aims to provide a comprehensive understanding of Singer's arguments and their implications for our actions and policies. Climate change poses us an unprecedented ethical challenge, compelling us to rethink our responsibilities towards strangers across the globe. Historically, ethical principles were tailored for small, localized communities where the repercussions of one actions were visible and immediate. But today, our actions, like driving cars or using electricity generated from fossil fuels, have invisible yet far reaching consequences affecting people we will never meet. Consider the haunting reality of climate change's impact. According to the World Health Organization, climate change caused an additional 140,000 deaths in 2004, a number comparable to significant global tragedies. This shocking statistic illuminates the indirect harm of our lifestyle can inflict, making us unwitting contributors to a global crisis. The plight of regions like Sundarbans or nations like the Maldives, which are disappearing under rising sea levels, brings this home. Imagine entire cultures and histories being swallowed by the sea, a direct consequence of the collective actions of those far away. Scientific bodies, such as Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, have painted a grim future if we don't act. Widespread water scarcity, millions exposed to flooding, and irreversible damage to ecosystems. This calls for a deep reflection on our ethical obligations. Do we, especially in the more industrialized nations, owe a greater responsibility to mitigate the harm we've historically contributed more to? The concept of historical responsibility suggests that countries with a long history of industrialization, thus contributing significantly to cumulative emissions, should shoulder a larger burden in addressing climate change. This perspective, however, is complicated when considering per capita emissions and the global benefits of industrialization. It raises a compelling question. Should the historical benefits of industrialization be offset against the historical responsibility for environmental damage? An alternative ethical approach is the principle of equal shares, proposing that everyone deserves an equal share of the Earth's atmospheric capacity. While equitable in theory, this approach challenges industrialized nations to drastic cuts in emissions while allowing room for developing countries to increase theirs for growth. This begs the question: is it fair to curtail the development of poorer nations for the sake of global environmental health? The luxury versus subsistence emissions debate offers The luxury versus subsistence emissions debate offers another lens, focusing on emissions necessary for basic needs versus those for more affluent lifestyles. This perspectives aligns with ethical frameworks that prioritize aiding the less fortunate. Imagine a world where the emissions from a farmer's modest machinery in a developing country are equated with those from luxury SUVs in a wealthy nation. Is this equivalent is this equivalence just? The use of the term aggression in climate ethics is jarring yet thought provoking. When affluent nations persist in high emissions, knowing the global harm caused, it mirrors an indirect form of warfare against vulnerable populations. Imagine being on the receiving end of such aggression, where your livelihood and home are threatened by not by armies, but by distant smokestacks and exhaust pipes. Utilitarianism, a theory that the best action is the one that maximizes overall happiness, is often applied to environmental issues. Singer, a proponent of this theory, applies utilitarian principles to assess the impacts of climate change. He argues that actions contributing to climate change could lead to more harm than good, thus violating the principles of utilitarianism. Singer's utilitarian approach to climate change involves a careful assessment of the costs and benefits of our actions. He argues that the costs of mitigating climate change, though significant, are outweighed by the benefits of preventing catastrophic damage to our planet and its habitants. Climate change has disproportionate effects on different regions, especially on poorer nations. These nations, which contribute to the least to global emissions, often bear the brunt of the impacts of climate change. Singer argues that wealthier nations, which are largely responsible for the current levels of greenhouse gases, have a normal responsibility to aid those who are affected by climate change. Singer's argument is grounded in the principle of distributive justice, which asserts that benefits and burdens should be distributed fairly. He argues that wealthier nations, by virtue of their greater contribution to climate change and their greater capacity to mitigate its effects, have a moral obligation to bear a larger share of the burden of addressing climate change.
The role of the individual in this crisis is nuanced. While one might think that personal efforts to reduce carbon footprints are like drops in the ocean, collectively they create ripples of change. These personal commitments can shape societal values and norms, eventually influencing larger policy decisions. Think of how individual choices to reduce meat consumption can drive down demand, impacting the livestock industry, a significant contributor to greenhouse gases. Governments grapple with finding the most effective ways to reduce emissions, be it through carbon trading schemes or direct taxation. These policies aim to make the cost of carbon emissions reflect their true environmental impact, incentivizing innovation in low emission industries. But this also raises questions about economic impacts and fairness. How do we balance the need for immediate action with the economic realities of different countries? The role of public awareness and activism cannot be overstated. The need for greater understanding and engagement in climate action is urgent. Imagine if the same level of public pressure and mobilization seen in other global movements were applied to climate change. Could this be the tipping point for meaningful action? Imagine you've decided to reduce your carbon footprint significantly. You started biking, going to work, cut down on meat consumption, and are conscientious about recycling. While these actions are commendable and set a positive example, Peter Singer, in his discussion on climate change, would prompt you to consider, is this individual action even enough to combat a global issue like climate change? Singer, known for his utilitarian approach to ethics, invites us to think about the balance between personal responsibility and collective action. He might illustrate this with an analogy. If climate change were a leaking boat, individual efforts to bail out water with a spoon, like recycling or using less water, are valuable. But what's truly needed is a coordinated effort to repair the boat itself. This repair job symbolizes systemic changes such as policy reforms, international agreements, and large-scale shifts in energy production. Singer's perspective shines a light on the limitations of personal choices when facing a challenge that demands action at both national and international levels. Imagine, for instance, the impact of a country committed to renewable energy sources versus an individual switching off their lights for an hour each day. Both actions are important, but their scales of impact differ vastly. This isn't to diminish the value of individual efforts. Instead, Singer encourages us to view our personal actions as part of a larger puzzle. By all means, let's continue to make ethical personal choices, but let's also advocate for and support broader systemic changes. Consider the ethical dilemmas we face. Is it fair for developed countries, which historically have contributed the most to carbon emissions, to demand the same stringent measures from developing countries? How do we balance immediate economic growth with long-term environmental sustainability? Singer's utilitarian approach, focusing on actions that maximize overall well-being, suggests that these questions don't have easy answers, but they are questions worth pondering. So, while you continue your commendable personal efforts to combat climate change, Singer's insights invite you to also think about the bigger picture. How can we, as collective, influence policy and systemic change? How can our individual choices feed into and support these larger actions? Critics of Peter Singer's utilitarian approach to climate change raise important concerns, particularly about its potential to oversimplify the complex socioeconomic dimensions of the issue. Consider a small, vulnerable island nation facing rising sea levels. While a utilitarian approach prioritizes actions benefiting the majority globally, it might overlook the dire circumstances of such smaller yet critically impacted communities. This raises a crucial ethical dilemma. How do we balance the greater good against the urgent needs of smaller, more vulnerable populations? Another significant critique concerns the feasibility of achieving global consensus on climate action. Envision trying to harmonize the diverse economic interests, cultural values, and political agendas of every country. Critics argue that this is not just about finding common ground, but also about the practicality of implementing ethical grounded solutions on a global scale. Can we realistically expect unified action, especially when the required sacrifices vary so greatly among countries? These counter-arguments invite us to think more deeply about climate change solutions. They challenge the idea of a one-size-fits-all solution and underscores the need for ethical frameworks that acknowledge and address the complexity of the issue. As we ponder these points, we're drawn into a richer, more nuanced conversation about how to navigate the ethical landscape of climate change policy and shared future on its planet. Now imagine a small fishing village on the brink of being submerged due to rising sea levels. Critics of Peter Singer's utilitarian approach to climate change highlight that such an approach might prioritize the greater global good, but overlook the plight of these smaller, vulnerable communities. This village's story serves as a stark reminder of the socioeconomic complexities of climate change. It poses a challenging question. How can we balance the utilitarian principle of the greatest good for the greatest number while ensuring that the voices and needs of marginalized groups are not lost in the process? Now, picture trying to organize a global conference where every nation, from economic powerhouses to tiny island states, must agree on a unified approach to climate change. Critics of Singer's perspective argue that achieving such global consensus is daunting, perhaps unrealistic. The difficulty lies not just in finding common ground, but in practical implementation of these solutions. Can we expect countries with varied economic and political interests to agree on a common path forward? Especially when some may have to bear a heavier burden than others. In essence, the ethical dilemmas posed by climate change demand a radical rethinking of our global responsibilities. They challenge us to balance historical accountability, equitable emissions, and the urgent need for sustainable development. As individuals, our seemingly small actions contribute to a larger collective effort to combat this crisis, and our voices can shape the policies that govern our global response. The question we must all grapple with is, how do we, as a global community, equitably share the responsibility of preserving our planet for future generations? In summary, Singer's exploration on climate change in practical ethics provides a comprehensive look at the ethical dimensions of individual and collective responses to this global crisis. His emphasis on the need for systemic change, viewed through a utilitarian lens, offers a unique perspective on the ethical responsibilities entailed in addressing climate change. While his approach has its critiques, it remains a significant contribution to the discourse on climate ethics, prompting reflection on both personal and policy level actions. Singer's work in this chapter is not just an academic exercise, but a call to action, urging a reevaluation of our roles in the global effort to mitigate climate change. Thank you.